The dining room glowed with warm amber light from the chandelier my mother had inherited from her grandmother. Crystal glasses caught the flicker of red candles, and the mahogany table groaned under the weight of perfectly arranged dishes. It was Christmas Eve 2019, and everything looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, everything except the tension that hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat at the far end of the table, picking at my mashed potatoes while my family celebrated around me. My name is Emma Collins, and at 27, I was supposedly the family disappointment. While my older brother Jake had just bought his third rental property and my younger sister Melissa was finishing her residency at Johns Hopkins, I was working 16-hour days at a tech startup in Austin that nobody had ever heard of. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there. Jake was explaining his latest real estate venture to our Uncle Tom, gesturing with his wine glass as he described flipping houses in Dallas. Melissa shared stories from the hospital, her voice animated as she talked about saving lives in the emergency room. Mom beamed at both of them, asking follow-up questions and hanging on every word. Then there was me, the one who had dropped out of law school after 2 years to join a company that made software for supply chain management, the one who lived in a cramped studio apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, the one who hadn't been on a real vacation in 3 years because every spare dollar went back into living expenses in one of Austin's most expensive neighborhoods, close enough to walk to work during those endless days. My father, Richard Collins, sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his domain. He was a successful investment banker who had built his wealth through calculated risks and conservative strategies. Everything about him screamed old. Money, from his perfectly pressed white shirt to the gold watch that had belonged to his father. He believed in traditional paths to success: prestigious universities, established corporations, steady paychecks, and predictable growth. The ham was carved, the wine was poured, and the annual tradition of family updates was in full swing. This was the moment I had been dreading all month. The moment when everyone would turn their attention to me and ask about my little computer job, with barely concealed pity in their voices. "So, Emma," my Aunt Carol said, her voice dripping with the kind of forced cheerfulness reserved for discussing uncomfortable topics. "How's work going? Are you still at that startup?" The table fell quiet. Even the background Christmas music seemed to lower its volume. I could feel 8 pairs of eyes on me, waiting for my response. I straightened my shoulders and tried to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. "It's going really well, actually. We just closed our Series B funding round, and we're expanding into 3 new markets next quarter. The growth has been incredible, and the technology we're building is really going to revolutionize how companies manage their supply chains." The words tumbled out of me in a rush. I was genuinely excited about what we were building at Streamline Solutions, but I could see the glazed look in their eyes. They didn't understand what a Series B funding round meant. They didn't care about supply chain optimization or the elegant algorithms we had developed to predict inventory needs across complex distribution networks. "That's nice, dear," my mother said in the same tone she might use to praise a child's finger painting. "But when are you going to get a real job? Something stable?" My stomach clenched. "This is a real job, Mom. We have over 200 employees now, and we're profitable. We're not just some guys in a garage anymore." Jake laughed, not unkindly, but with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own choices. I get it. The startup thing sounds exciting. But you've been doing this for what, 4 years now? Maybe it's time to think about joining an established company. Get some benefits, some job security. I could talk to some people at the bank." "I have benefits," I said quietly. "And I have equity in the company. Stock options." The words hung in the air for a moment before my father cleared his throat. When Richard Collins cleared his throat, everyone listened. He had a way of commanding attention without raising his voice, a skill honed through decades of boardroom negotiations. "Emma," he said, his voice measured and calm, "I've been patient with this entrepreneurial phase of yours. We all have. But you're almost 30 years old, and you're still playing with computers like you're in college." My cheeks burned. "I'm not playing, Dad. I'm building something." "Building what?" His tone was gentle, almost pitying, which somehow made it worse than if he had yelled. "A company that could disappear tomorrow? Stock options that might never be worth anything? You're gambling with your future, sweetheart." The endearment felt like a slap. I looked around the table at my family, all of them nodding along with his assessment. My mother's face showed concern mixed with embarrassment. My siblings looked uncomfortable but didn't disagree. Even my cousins, who I had grown up with, seemed to be studying their plates rather than meeting my eyes. "The stock options are worth something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The company is valued at over $50 million now." My father leaned back in his chair and picked up his wine glass. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gesture was casual, dismissive. "Valuation on paper means nothing, Emma. I've seen 1,000 promising companies crash and burn. I've watched brilliant people lose everything chasing dreams that were never realistic in the first place." He took a sip of wine and continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone I remembered from childhood. "Do you know what your problem is? You're too idealistic. You think because you're working hard and believing in something, that's enough. But the real world doesn't work that way. Success comes from making smart, conservative choices and building wealth slowly over time." The room was completely silent now, except for the soft crackling of the fire. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as my father delivered what felt like a closing argument. "I've invested a lot in your education, in your future. Law school wasn't cheap, and even though you didn't finish, I supported your decision to find your own path. But frankly, Emma, you've been the worst investment I've ever made." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gasped, my hand flying to my chest as if I could somehow catch the breath that had been knocked out of me. The worst investment he'd ever made. Not a disappointing daughter, not someone who had made poor choices, but a bad investment. A financial calculation that hadn't paid off? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I could hear my Aunt Carol shift uncomfortably in her chair. My mother made a small sound, maybe to say something, but my father held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not saying this to be cruel," he continued, his voice still maddeningly calm. "I'm saying it because someone needs to tell you the truth. You're living in a fantasy world and it's time to wake up. Join a real company. Get a steady salary. Start building actual wealth instead of chasing Silicon Valley fairy tales." I looked around the table one more time, searching for someone, anyone, who might defend me or at least look uncomfortable with what had just happened. But they were all avoiding my eyes now, focused on their food or their drinks or the candles flickering in the center of the table. My sister Melissa finally spoke up, but not in the way I had hoped. "Dad's right, Em. I mean, maybe he could have said it nicer, but you're almost 30. Most of our friends are buying houses, starting families. You're still living like you're 22. Even Jake nodded, though he looked slightly guilty about it. "The real estate market is booming right now. If you had a stable income, I could help you get into an investment property. Build some actual equity instead of hoping your company makes it big." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not broke, exactly, but realigned. I had come to this dinner hoping for support, maybe even pride, as I tried to explain what we were building at Streamline. Instead, I had been reduced to a line item on my father's balance sheet. A failed investment, a cautionary tale. I stood up slowly, my legs surprisingly steady despite the way my hands were shaking. Every eye in the room followed me as I carefully placed my napkin beside my plate and pushed my chair back under the table. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice clearer than I had expected. "It was delicious, Mom." My mother looked stricken. "Emma, honey, don't leave like this. Your father didn't mean—" "Yes, he did," I interrupted gently. "And that's okay." I think I needed to hear it. I walked around the table and kissed my mother's cheek, then my grandmother's. I hugged my siblings, though the embraces felt hollow and forced. When I got to my father, he stood up and opened his arms. "Emma, you know I love you. I just want what's best for you." I hugged him too, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and the wood smoke from the fireplace. For just a moment, I was 7 years old again, sitting on his lap while he read me bedtime stories. But that little girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who had just learned exactly how her family saw her. "I know, Dad," I whispered into his shoulder. "I love you too." I gathered my coat and purse from the front hall, the sounds of stilted conversation resuming behind me. They were probably already moving on, relieved that the uncomfortable moment had passed. Maybe they thought I would sleep on it and come back tomorrow, ready to listen to reason and start job hunting at established companies. The cold Austin air hit my face as I stepped out into the night. Christmas lights twinkled on houses throughout my parents' upscale neighborhood, and I could hear laughter and music drifting from other family gatherings. Normal families, I thought bitterly. Families who supported each other's dreams instead of calculating their return on investment. I sat in my Honda Civic for a long time, letting the engine warm up while I processed what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Please don't drive angry. Come back and we'll talk." Then another from Melissa. "Dad feels bad. He's just worried about you." Even Jake sent a message. "You know we're all rooting for you, right?" But I wasn't angry. That was the strange thing. I was something else. Entirely. Determined, maybe. Focused. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I drove back to my studio apartment through empty streets, most of Austin celebrating with their families. My building was quiet, the courtyard lit only by a single strand of white lights someone had hung around the small fountain. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and let myself into my tiny space. The apartment was cramped, but organized. A.E. Murphy bed that I folded down every night. A small kitchen table that doubled as my desk. Bookshelves lined with programming manuals and business biographies. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every stick of furniture, every book, every coffee mug had been earned through my own work. I opened my laptop and stared at the Streamline Solutions logo on my desktop. Tomorrow was a holiday, but I knew our CTO Marcus would be online. He was the kind of person who solved complex problems for fun, even on Christmas. I had been working with him for 3 years, and he had become more than a colleague. He was a mentor, a friend, and someone who actually understood what we were building. My father thought I was chasing Silicon Valley fairy tales, but he had no idea what we had actually accomplished. Streamline wasn't just another app or a social media platform. We had created something that genuinely solved real problems for real companies. Our clients were saving millions of dollars annually by using our software to optimize their supply chains. We had government contracts, Fortune 500 partnerships, and a technology stack that our competitors couldn't replicate. More importantly, we had something my father's generation didn't understand: equity that was about to mature. Our Series C funding round was scheduled for Q2 of 2020, and the preliminary valuations were staggering. The company that was worth $50 million when I tried to explain it at dinner was about to be worth significantly more. But I wasn't thinking about money as I sat in my tiny apartment that Christmas night. I was thinking about respect. about being seen as something more than a failed investment, about proving that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards. I opened a new document and started typing. Not a resignation letter or an angry email to my family. Instead, I began outlining my goals for the next year, professional milestones, financial objectives, and personal boundaries I needed to set. I wrote until the sun came up, clarifying thoughts that had been swirling in my head for months. The worst investment he'd ever made. The words echoed in my mind, but they didn't sting anymore. They had become something else entirely, a challenge, a promise, a prediction that I was going to prove spectacularly wrong. I woke up on Christmas, morning to the sound of silence, no family chaos, no rushing to open presents, no obligations pulling me in different directions, just the gentle hum of my air conditioning and sunlight streaming through my small apartment window. For the first time in years, Christmas morning belonged entirely to me. My phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing intermittently with messages from my family. I could see the notifications piling up without reading them. Mom asking if I was okay. Jake suggesting we grab coffee later to talk things through. Even my grandmother had somehow figured out how to send a text, her message appearing in all capital letters. "Emma dear, please call me, we love you." But I wasn't ready to engage with their concern or their guilt. Instead, I made coffee in my small French press and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, diving into work emails that had accumulated over the holiday. Marcus had indeed been online late into the night, sending detailed notes about our upcoming product launch and sharing articles about companies that had successfully navigated rapid scaling. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family saw my work as frivolous, here I was spending Christmas morning analyzing market penetration strategies and reviewing code architecture. This wasn't the behavior of someone playing with computers. This was the dedication of someone building something significant. I spent the morning crafting a comprehensive analysis of our competitive landscape, something I had been meaning to tackle for weeks, but hadn't found the uninterrupted time to complete. Working on Christmas felt liberating rather than sad. Every hour I invested was an hour closer to proving my father wrong, an hour closer to transforming his worst investment into his biggest surprise. Around noon, I decided to drive to the office. Streamline Solutions occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in East Austin, and I knew the building would be empty except for the security guard and maybe a few other workaholics like myself. The space reflected our company culture, exposed. Brick walls covered with whiteboards full of algorithms, comfortable lounge areas with vintage furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the workspace with natural light. I badged into the building and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where the executive team had their offices. My title was Director of Strategic Operations, a role that had evolved organically as the company grew. I wore multiple hats, analyzing market trends, optimizing internal processes, managing key client relationships, and serving as a bridge between our technical team and our business development efforts. The office felt different when it was empty. Without the usual buzz of conversations and keyboard clicks, I could hear the building settling around me, the distant hum of traffic from the street below. I made my way to my corner office, a space I had earned through 3 years of 16-hour days and weekend work sessions. My desk was organized chaos, multiple monitors displaying dashboards and spreadsheets, stacks of printed reports annotated with my handwriting, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrived despite my erratic watering schedule. On the wall hung a whiteboard covered with interconnected diagrams showing our client relationships, revenue projections, and strategic priorities for the coming year. I pulled up our internal financial dashboard and began reviewing numbers that my family couldn't comprehend. Our annual recurring revenue had grown by 340% over the past 18 months. Our client retention rate was 94%, almost unheard of in the enterprise software space. We had cash reserves that would fund operations for 2 years even if we stopped. Acquiring new customers tomorrow, which was virtually impossible given our current growth trajectory. More importantly, I pulled up the equity management system and reviewed my stock option grants. I had been with the company since employee number 15, back when we were still operating out of a co-working space and surviving on ramen noodles and venture capital fumes. My initial grant had been modest, but I had earned additional options through performance bonuses and promotions. The vesting schedule was structured so that my holdings would mature in tranches over 4 years, with the largest portion becoming available in March 2020. The preliminary valuations for our Series C funding round were mind-blowing. Conservative estimates put the company value at $400 million, with optimistic projections reaching as high as $600 million. Even using the conservative numbers, my fully vested options would be worth more money than my father had made in some of his best years as an investment banker. But the money wasn't really the point. The point was validation. The point was proving that my path, unconventional as it might be, was leading somewhere significant. The point was showing my family that success couldn't always be measured by traditional metrics like steady paychecks and predictable career ladders. I spent the afternoon creating a detailed presentation that I would never give to my family, at least not yet. Slide after slide of revenue charts, client testimonials, market analysis, and growth projections. I wasn't preparing to defend myself to them. I was preparing to understand my own position more clearly. Sometimes you need to see your accomplishments, laid out in PowerPoint format, to truly grasp their magnitude. As evening approached, I realized I hadn't eaten since my morning coffee. The building's cafeteria was closed for the holiday, so I walked to a small Vietnamese restaurant nearby that stayed open on Christmas. The owner, Mrs. Nguyen, recognized me as a regular customer and insisted on giving me extra spring rolls because I was eating alone on a holiday. "You work too much," she said with a knowing smile as she handed me the takeout bag. "But I think you're building something important, yes?" I nodded, touched by her simple acknowledgement. This elderly woman who barely knew me understood something my own family couldn't grasp. Recognition came from the most unexpected places sometimes. Back at my apartment that evening, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I wasn't going to engage with my family's attempts to reconcile until I had something concrete to show them. Not out of spite, but out of strategy. Every text message asking me to call, every voicemail expressing concern, every attempt to smooth over what had happened at dinner would receive the same response: polite deflection. I crafted a simple message that I sent to each family member who had reached out. "I appreciate your concern and I love you all. I need some time to focus on work right now, but we'll talk soon." Short, professional, and impossible to argue with. It bought me the space I needed without burning any bridges. The next few days blurred together in a haze of productivity. I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me. I arrived at the office before sunrise and stayed until the security guard started his evening rounds. I initiated conversations with potential clients that had been lingering in our pipeline for months. I wrote detailed analyses of market opportunities that could accelerate our growth. I even taught myself new programming languages so I could better understand the technical aspects of our product development. Marcus noticed the change immediately. On December 28th, he knocked on my office door around 8 in the evening, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the concerned expression of someone who had seen too many brilliant people burn themselves out. "Emma, you've been here every day since Christmas. Even by your standards, this is intense. Everything okay?" I accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured for him to sit in the chair across from my desk. Marcus was 10 years older than me, with the kind of calm wisdom that came from surviving multiple startup cycles. He had joined Streamline after selling his previous company to Google, and his presence had been crucial in attracting top talent and serious investors. "I'm fine," I said, then reconsidered. Marcus had always been straight with me, and I owed him the same honesty. "Actually, I had a rough Christmas with my family. Nothing dramatic, just a reminder that they don't really understand what we're doing here." He nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. Let me guess. They think you should get a real job at an established company? Something like that. I didn't elaborate on my father's specific words, but Marcus seemed to understand the general dynamic. You know, when I was your age, my dad wanted me to take over his accounting firm. Stable clients, predictable income, a clear path to comfortable middle-class success. He couldn't understand why I wanted to build software that might fail spectacularly, instead of inheriting a business that was guaranteed to provide a decent living. What changed his mind? Marcus laughed. The Google acquisition. Nothing. Quite shifts family perspective like a public exit that gets covered in TechCrunch. But even before that, I had to learn to stop seeking his approval and start trusting my own judgment. We talked for another hour about family expectations, entrepreneurial risk-taking, and the psychological challenges of building something from nothing. Marcus shared stories from his previous ventures, both the failures and the successes, and helped me understand that my family's skepticism wasn't personal. It was generational, cultural, and ultimately irrelevant to the work we were doing. The beautiful thing about equity, he said as he was leaving, is that it's patient. It waits for you to prove everyone wrong. His words stayed with me through the new year. I established a routine that prioritized my professional growth while maintaining radio silence with my family. I woke up at 5:30 each morning and spent an hour reading industry publications before heading to the office. I scheduled regular check-ins with our major clients, not because there were problems, but because I wanted to understand their evolving needs and identify expansion opportunities. I also began networking more aggressively within Austin's tech community. I attended meetups, spoke on panels, and built relationships with entrepreneurs, investors, and executives at other high-growth companies. My father might not understand what I was building, but these people did. They asked intelligent questions about our technology, our market strategy, and our competitive advantages. They treated me as a peer rather than a wayward daughter who needed career guidance. January flew by in a blur of client meetings, product development sessions, and strategy planning for the year ahead. Our Series C funding round was progressing, ahead of schedule, with multiple venture capital firms expressing serious interest. The lead investor, a prominent Silicon Valley firm that had backed several billion-dollar companies, was particularly excited about our growth trajectory and market opportunity. I was deep in due diligence preparations when my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in early February. My mother's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail like I had been doing for weeks. But something made me answer. Hi, Mom. Emma? Oh, honey, I'm so glad you picked up. I've been worried sick about you. Her voice carried the mix of relief and reproach that I remembered from childhood, the tone she used when I had stayed out, past curfew or forgotten to call after arriving safely at a friend's house. I'm fine, Mom. Just busy with work. That's what I'm worried about. Your father feels terrible about what he said at Christmas dinner. We all do. Can't you come over this weekend so we can talk things through? I leaned back in my office chair, watching Austin traffic crawl by on the street below. 6 weeks had passed since Christmas dinner, and the urgency of that night had crystallized into something more sustainable. Focus. I appreciate that, but I'm not ready yet. I need to finish some things at work first. Finish what things? Emma, you're missing family events. You haven't returned your sister's calls, and your grandmother asks about you every time I talk. To her. Whatever point you're trying to make, I think you've made it. The assumption that I was making a point rather than making progress irritated me more than it should have. I'm not trying to make a point, Mom. I'm trying to build something important, and it requires my full attention right now. More important than your family? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with guilt and expectation. A few months ago, it might have worked. I might have apologized and promised to come to Sunday dinner, to call more often, to be more present in their lives even if they weren't present in mine. Right now, yes, I said quietly. More important than Sunday dinners and birthday parties and conversations where everyone talks around me instead of to me. My mother sighed, the sound carrying across the phone line like a small surrender. Your father really didn't mean what he said the way it sounded. Yes, he did, and that's okay. He's allowed to think I'm a bad investment. I'm allowed to prove him wrong. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the sun set behind the Austin skyline. The conversation with my mother had clarified something important. I wasn't avoiding my family out of anger or hurt feelings. I was protecting my focus and energy for the work that mattered most. Every hour spent managing their emotions or defending my choices was an hour I couldn't spend building the future I was working toward. The Series C funding round closed in March, exactly as planned. The final valuation came in at $480 million, beating even our optimistic projections. Our investor meeting was held in a conference room overlooking downtown Austin, with lawyers and accountants and venture capitalists discussing terms that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. I sat at that conference table, reviewing documents that would make me wealthy beyond anything my family could imagine, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Calm. Not excitement, not vindication, just the quiet satisfaction of seeing a plan come together. The worst investment my father had ever made was about to pay dividends he never could have calculated. But I still wasn't ready to call home. The money was just the beginning, not the end goal. I wanted to see where this path would lead, how far I could push the boundaries of what was possible. My family would be there when I was ready to share my success. The stock options, on the other hand, had an expiration date. I spent that evening alone in my apartment, drinking wine and reading congratulatory emails from colleagues and clients. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new reasons to keep building something that mattered. Tonight was just for me, for acknowledging how far I had traveled from that Christmas dinner table, where I had been reduced to a line item on someone else's balance sheet. The worst investment, indeed. My father had no idea how right he was about to be proven wrong. Spring arrived in Austin with the kind of explosive beauty that made the city famous. Bluebonnets carpeted the highways, and the smell of barbecue and live music drifted through downtown streets. I barely noticed. My world had narrowed to a focused tunnel of work, growth, and strategic execution that consumed every waking hour. The Series C funding had transformed Streamline Solutions overnight. We moved into a gleaming new headquarters in the Domain, Austin's premier business district. My corner office on the 15th floor offered panoramic views of the hill country, and I found myself staying late just to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was literally rising above my previous limitations. My role had evolved again, this time to Vice President of Strategic Growth. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, additional stock options, and responsibility for our expansion into international markets. I was leading a team of 12 brilliant people, managing relationships with Fortune 100 clients, and presenting monthly reports to our board of directors. At 28, I was the youngest VP in the company's history. The board meetings were particularly satisfying. I sat at polished conference tables with seasoned executives and venture capitalists, discussing market penetration strategies and competitive analysis with the kind of authority that comes from deep expertise. These weren't people who questioned my career choices or suggested I find a real job. They valued my insights, implemented my recommendations, and compensated me handsomely for results. During one particularly memorable board meeting in April, our CEO Sarah Chen announced that 3 major consulting firms had approached us about potential acquisition offers. The preliminary numbers being discussed were staggering, well over $1 billion. My stock options, which had seemed like gambling chips to my family, were suddenly looking like lottery tickets that might actually pay off. But even as my professional life soared to new heights, The silence from my family had become a constant background noise. My phone still buzzed regularly with messages I didn't answer and calls I didn't return. The texts had evolved from concern to frustration to a kind of desperate pleading that I found both heartbreaking and validating. My mother had started sending photos, family dinners where my empty chair was visible, birthday celebrations that felt incomplete without me, Easter brunch where my grandmother kept asking where I was. The visual guilt trips were sophisticated, designed to remind me of what I was missing while avoiding direct confrontation about why I was missing it. Jake had tried a different approach, sending professional networking requests and articles about successful women in tech. His messages carried an undertone of newfound respect, as if he had finally Googled my company and realized it wasn't the amateur hour he had imagined. Saw the TechCrunch article about Streamline's funding round. One text read, "Pretty impressive, Em. We should talk." Even my father had attempted outreach, though his messages retained the measured tone of someone accustomed to negotiating from a position of strength. "Emma, I've been following your company's progress in the business journals. I may have underestimated the opportunity you're pursuing. I'd like to discuss your portfolio strategy when you have time." The irony was delicious. My father, who had dismissed my stock options as worthless gambling, was now interested in discussing my portfolio strategy. The man who had called me his worst investment was suddenly treating me like a client worthy of his professional attention. But I wasn't ready for any of those conversations. Not because I was angry, but because I was finally becoming the person I had always known I could be. Without the constant drain of family dynamics, I had discovered reserves of energy and creativity I hadn't known existed. I was thinking bigger, taking calculated risks, and achieving results that surprised even me. The international expansion I was leading had exceeded every projection. We had signed major contracts in London, Toronto, and Sydney, with promising negotiations underway in Singapore and Munich. Our European clients were particularly enthusiastic about our technology, and several had indicated interest in exclusive, regional partnerships that could multiply our revenue streams. I had also begun speaking at industry conferences, sharing insights about supply chain optimization and emerging market trends. My presentations were drawing standing ovations and generating buzz on social media. A profile in Forbes had featured me in their 30 under 30 list for enterprise technology, and Harvard Business School had invited me to guest lecture in their entrepreneurship program. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it was building my personal brand independent of Streamline Solutions. I was becoming known as an expert in my field, someone whose opinions carried weight in boardrooms and whose insights shaped industry conversations. The girl who had been told to find a real job was now being courted by headhunters from Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. My personal life had also undergone a complete transformation. I had moved out of my cramped studio apartment and into a sleek downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Lady Bird Lake. The space reflected my evolving identity. Modern furniture chosen for comfort rather than budget constraints, original artwork from local Austin artists, and a home office equipped with the same high-end technology I used at work. I had started dating someone, too. David was a surgeon at Del Seaton Medical Center, brilliant and driven in his own field but refreshingly uncomplicated about mine. He understood long hours and high-pressure decisions, and he never questioned my priorities or suggested I needed better work-life balance. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared ambition rather than traditional expectations about how women should manage their careers. The contrast with my family's perspective was stark. David celebrated my successes without trying to diminish them or redirect them toward more conventional paths. When I told him about the acquisition discussions, he opened a bottle of champagne and toasted my brilliance. When I mentioned the Forbes recognition, he framed the article and hung it in his office. He understood that my career wasn't just a job. It was the expression of everything I was capable of achieving. By summer, the acquisition talks had intensified. We were in serious negotiations with two major players, an established enterprise software company based in San Francisco, and a German conglomerate looking to expand their North American operations. Both offers were substantially higher than the billion-dollar figures initially discussed, reflecting the strength of our growth trajectory and the strategic value of our technology platform. I found myself at the center of these negotiations, not just as an employee with stock options, but as a key executive whose expertise would be crucial to any successful integration. The acquiring companies weren't just buying our software. They were buying our team, our relationships, and our deep understanding of supply chain challenges across multiple industries. The German company, Brenner Industries, was particularly interested in my international expansion work. They had invited me to Munich for a week of strategic planning sessions, where I would help design the integration roadmap and identify synergies between our operations. The trip would be my first time leading negotiations of this magnitude, and I felt both excited and slightly terrified by the responsibility. Munich turned out to be a revelation. The Brenner headquarters occupied an entire city block, with sleek modern architecture that somehow managed to feel both imposing and welcoming. The executives I met with treated me as an equal from the moment I walked into the conference room, seeking my input on everything from market positioning to cultural integration challenges. During one particularly intense day of meetings, Klaus, Brenner himself, the CEO and grandson of the company's founder, pulled me aside for a private conversation. He was a man in his 50s with the kind of quiet authority that reminded me of my father, but without the condescension I had grown accustomed to at home. "Emma," he said as we walked through the company's executive lounge, "I want you to know that you're not just part of this acquisition. You're one of the primary reasons we're pursuing it. Your work in international markets has been extraordinary, and we see enormous potential for expansion under your leadership." He paused by a window overlooking Munich's historic district, his expression thoughtful. "I've been in business for 30 years, and I can recognize exceptional talent when I see it. You have something that can't be taught: the ability to see opportunities that others miss, and the courage to pursue them even when conventional wisdom suggests caution." The conversation continued over dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant, where Klaus shared stories from his own career and asked probing questions about my vision for global expansion. By the end of the evening, he had made me an offer that took my breath away. If the acquisition went through, I would become Brenner's Vice President of Global Operations, with responsibility for integrating supply chain solutions across their worldwide network of companies. The position would come with a base salary that was triple what I was currently earning, plus equity in Brenner Industries, and a relocation package that would set me up comfortably in Munich, London, or any other European city I preferred. It was the kind of opportunity that could define an entire career, the sort of role that typically required decades of experience at established multinational corporations. Flying back to Austin, I stared out the airplane window at the clouds below and tried to process how dramatically my life had changed in less than a year. The girl who had been called the worst investment at Christmas dinner was now being courted by one of Europe's most successful industrial companies. The stock options my family had dismissed as worthless gambling were about to generate more wealth than most people accumulated in a lifetime of traditional employment. But the most profound change wasn't financial or professional. It was psychological. I had stopped seeking external validation and started trusting my own judgment. I had learned to recognize my worth without needing others to acknowledge it first. The silence from my family had been painful at first, but it had also been liberating. Without their constant doubts and suggestions, I had discovered what I was truly capable of achieving. Back in Austin, the acquisition process accelerated rapidly. Due diligence teams from both potential buyers descended on our offices, analyzing every aspect of our operations. As one of the key executives, I spent countless hours in conference rooms, explaining our technology, defending our market strategy, and projecting future growth scenarios. The German offer ultimately prevailed, partly because of their vision for international expansion and partly because Klaus had made it clear that retaining our senior leadership team was a non-negotiable priority. The final purchase price was $4 billion, a figure that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier when we were bootstrapping operations in a co-working space. My stock options, fully vested as of the acquisition closing, would be worth approximately $120 million after taxes. The number was so large it felt abstract, like a theoretical calculation rather than money I would actually control. I had gone from struggling to afford rent on a studio apartment to possessing more wealth than most people could imagine. The news broke in the Wall Street Journal on a Tuesday morning in October. The headline read, "German industrial giant acquires Austin tech startup for $4 billion. My name was mentioned in the third paragraph as one of the key executives joining Brenner's leadership team, but the article focused primarily on the strategic rationale for the acquisition and the growth potential in international markets. I was in my office, reviewing integration timelines with my team, when my phone started buzzing incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, and voicemails poured in from numbers I hadn't seen in months. My family had finally connected the dots between the business news and their wayward daughter, who had been ignoring their calls since Christmas. My mother's message was typical. "Emma, I just saw the news about your company. Are you okay? Please, call me. We need to talk." The assumption that I might not be okay, that sudden wealth and professional success were somehow problems requiring family intervention, perfectly captured the disconnect that had driven me away in the first place. Jake's approach was more direct. "Holy shit, Em. Is this real? Did you just become a millionaire? Call me back immediately." At least he was honest about his motivations, though his amazement suggested he had never fully grasped the potential of what I was building. Even my father, the master of measured communication, seemed genuinely stunned. "Emma, I've been reading about the Brenner acquisition. I clearly underestimated the opportunity you were pursuing. I would very much like to discuss your financial planning needs when you're available." The messages continued throughout the day, each one revealing something about how my family processed unexpected success. They were shocked, excited, confused, and probably a little embarrassed about their previous dismissals of my career choices. But none of them had asked the question I most wanted to hear. "Are you proud of what you've accomplished?" That evening, I sat in my downtown condo with a glass of wine, watching the sunset reflect off the lake and trying to decide how to respond to my family's sudden renewed interest in my life. The financial security was life-changing, but the validation was what I had been working toward all along. Not their validation, but my own. The certainty that I had made the right choices and followed the right path, even when everyone around me suggested otherwise. I thought about Klaus Brenner's words in Munich, about exceptional talent and the courage to pursue opportunities that others missed. I thought about Marcus's advice about trusting my own judgment rather than seeking family approval. I thought about the journey from that Christmas dinner to this moment, from being called the worst investment to becoming someone whose expertise was valued at 9 figures. The money would change everything, but it wouldn't define everything. I had work to do, an international expansion to lead, and a career to build on my own terms. My family would have to wait a little longer for their explanations and reconciliations. I wasn't ready to share my success until I was certain they understood it was mine to share, not theirs to celebrate or claim credit for. The worst investment had finally matured, but the dividends were still being calculated. The weeks following the acquisition announcement transformed my relationship with the world in ways I hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know Emma Collins. Investment advisors called daily with portfolio management pitches. Real estate agents sent glossy brochures for multi-million-dollar properties. Austin's social scene, which had never particularly interested me, opened doors I didn't know existed. More intriguingly, my family's desperation had reached fever pitch. The phone calls came at all hours now, not just from immediate family, but from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, high school friends who had somehow tracked down my number, and even former colleagues who suddenly remembered how much they had always believed in my potential. The transparent opportunism was both amusing and disappointing. My grandmother, bless her heart, had apparently enlisted my Aunt Carol to stage what amounted to an intervention. They showed up at my office on a Thursday afternoon in November, carrying homemade cookies and wearing matching expressions of determined concern. The receptionist called up to warn me, and I had to admire their tactical approach. They knew I wouldn't refuse to see my 84-year-old grandmother, especially when she had driven 3 hours from Houston specifically to ambush me. "Emma Christine Collins," my grandmother announced as she settled into the plush chair across from my desk. "You look entirely too thin, and this office is far too fancy for a girl who used to build blanket forts in my living room." I couldn't help but smile. Grandma Rose had always possessed the supernatural ability to cut through pretense and reduce complex situations to their emotional core. She studied my face with the sharp intelligence that had made her a successful elementary school principal for 40 years. "Now then," she continued, accepting the cup of tea my assistant had brought, "I want you to tell me exactly what your parents said at Christmas dinner, because the version I've been getting doesn't make a lick of sense." Aunt Carol shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Mom, maybe we should ease into this conversation." "Nonsense. Emma's a grown woman running a billion-dollar company. She can handle direct questions." Grandma Rose fixed me with the look that had terrified generations of misbehaving students. "Well," so I told her. Everything. The precise words my father had used, the laughter that had followed, the way everyone had avoided my eyes while he reduced me to a failed financial calculation. I described the drive home, the months of silence, and the strange liberation I had found in proving them all spectacularly wrong. My grandmother listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, sipping her tea and processing information with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among her colleagues. "Carol," she finally said to my aunt, "I need you to drive me to Richard and Patricia's house right now." "Mom, maybe we should—" "Right now, Carol. And Emma, you're coming with us." It wasn't really a request. When Rose Collins decided something needed to happen, resistance was futile. 20 minutes later, I found myself in the passenger seat of my aunt's SUV, following my grandmother's precise directions toward my childhood home in Westlake Hills. The house looked exactly as I remembered: sprawling limestone facade, perfectly manicured lawn, 3-car garage housing my father's BMW, my mother's Mercedes, and Jake's pickup truck. Apparently, the whole family was gathering for what had become their regular Thursday dinners, a tradition that had started after I disappeared from their lives. My grandmother marched up the front walkway with the determined stride of someone half her age. She didn't ring the doorbell. She used her own key, a privilege that came with decades of being the family matriarch. The sound of surprised voices echoed from the dining room as we entered the foyer. "Richard!" my grandmother called out in her teacher voice, the tone that brooked no argument. "Patricia! Get yourselves in here immediately." My parents appeared, in the hallway, followed by Jake and Melissa, all of them freezing mid-step when they saw me standing behind my grandmother. The silence stretched uncomfortably until my mother broke it with a tentative smile. "Emma. Oh, sweetheart. What a wonderful surprise. We were just sitting down to dinner. There's plenty of food if you'd like to." "Nobody's eating anything," my grandmother interrupted, "until we clear the air about Christmas dinner and why my granddaughter has been avoiding her family for nearly a year." My father stepped forward, his banker's composure firmly in place despite the obvious ambush. "Mother Rose, perhaps we could discuss this privately." Emma and I have been trying to arrange a conversation for months. Have you now? Grandma Rose's eyebrows rose dangerously. Because from what I understand, you called her your worst investment, and then sat back while everyone laughed. Is that the conversation you've been trying to arrange? The color drained from my father's face. Jake and Melissa exchanged guilty glances, while my mother suddenly found the hardwood floor fascinating. The family's carefully constructed narrative about miscommunication and hurt feelings crumbled under my grandmother's relentless scrutiny. I may have chosen my words poorly, my father said carefully, but my concerns about Emma's career path were legitimate. The startup environment is inherently risky, and I was trying to what? My grandmother's voice could have cut glass. Humiliate your daughter in front of the entire family? Reduce her accomplishments to numbers on a balance sheet? Make her feel so unwelcome that she disappeared for a year? Now, that's not entirely fair, my mother interjected. We've all been worried sick about Emma. We've called and texted constantly, trying to reach out. After you realized she might actually be successful, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the house. After the business journals started covering my company and you figured out that my worthless stock options were about to make me wealthy. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. My family had always prided themselves on their sophisticated communication skills, but suddenly no one seemed to know what to say. The truth was too uncomfortable to acknowledge and too obvious to deny. Melissa tried to salvage the situation with characteristic medical precision. Emma, we never meant to make you feel unwelcome. We love you, and we're incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. Maybe we didn't express that well at Christmas. But surely you know how we feel about you. Do I asked, genuinely curious. Because for 3 years, every family gathering included suggestions that I find a real job. Every conversation about my work was met with polite skepticism or outright dismissal. I brought home straight A's my entire life, graduated summa cum laude, and built a career in one of the fastest-growing industries in the world. What exactly gave you the impression that I needed your career guidance? Jake cleared his throat uncomfortably. You have to understand it from our perspective. Tech startups fail all the time. We were just worried about your financial security. Were you worried about my financial security? Or were you embarrassed that I wasn't following a traditional path? Because there's a difference between concern and condescension, and I received a lot more of the latter. My father finally found his voice again, though it carried less authority than usual. Emma, I spoke harshly that night, and I regret that. But you have to admit that your reaction has been disproportionate. Cutting off all contact for nearly a year over a single comment seems excessive. The comment revealed everything about how he processed the situation. A single comment. As if years of dismissive treatment could be reduced to one unfortunate choice of words. As if the pattern of behavior that had driven me away was just a momentary lapse in judgment. Dad, I said, settling onto the living room couch with the calm confidence that came from knowing I held all the cards in this conversation. You didn't just make a single comment. You made a calculation. You looked at your daughter, evaluated her choices against your personal definition of success, and concluded that I was a bad investment. That wasn't anger or concern talking. That was your honest assessment of my worth. He started to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. And you know what? You were absolutely right to make that calculation. Because I was never actually your investment in the first place. I was your daughter, and there's a difference between supporting someone you love and expecting a return on your financial outlay. My grandmother nodded approvingly from her chair, while my parents struggled to process the distinction I was drawing. They had raised their children with the unconscious assumption that parental support came with implicit expectations about future success and family loyalty. The idea that I might reject those expectations entirely was genuinely confusing to them. But we do support you, my mother said desperately. We've always supported you. We paid for your education. We welcomed you at family gatherings. We celebrated your achievements. You celebrated achievements that fit your definition of success, I corrected. You celebrated my grades because they confirmed your belief in traditional academic excellence. You welcomed me at family gatherings as long as I played the role you expected. But when I chose a path that didn't match your vision for my life, the support evaporated pretty quickly. The conversation continued for another hour, with my family cycling through the classic stages of denial, bargaining, and selective memory, revision. They insisted that they had always believed in me, that their concerns were purely practical, that my reaction to Christmas dinner had been an overinterpretation of words spoken in frustration. But their revisionist history couldn't change the fundamental dynamic that had driven me away. They loved me conditionally, based on my willingness to accept their judgment about my choices. They supported me enthusiastically when I excelled, within their expectations, and skeptically when I ventured beyond them. The acquisition had changed their perspective, not because they had gained new insight into my character, but because external validation had finally aligned with their definition of success. As the evening wore on, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: pity. My family wasn't deliberately cruel or calculating. They were simply operating from a worldview that equated love with control and support with approval. They genuinely couldn't understand why I had withdrawn from their influence, because they couldn't imagine that their influence might be unwelcome. My grandmother had remained largely silent during the extended discussion, but as the conversation began to wind down, she stood up with the decisive movement of someone who had heard enough. "Well," she announced, "I think we've all learned something important tonight. Emma has built herself a life that makes her happy and successful, and she did it without needing anyone's permission. The rest of you have been so busy worrying about whether she was making the right choices that you forgot to notice she was making brilliant ones." She walked over to where I was sitting and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Not because you're wealthy now, but because you had the courage to trust yourself when everyone else was telling you to be someone different." The simplicity of her statement highlighted everything my family had failed to understand. Pride-based, on character rather than achievement. Support offered without conditions or expectations. Love that didn't require constant validation or conformity. "Thank you, Grandma," I said, covering her hand with mine. "That means more to me than you know." As we prepared to leave, my parents made one final attempt at reconciliation. They invited me to Thanksgiving dinner, promising that things would be different now that they understood my perspective better. They suggested regular family meetings to rebuild our relationship and asked if I would consider including them in major life decisions going forward. Their overtures were well-intentioned, but fundamentally missed the point. They were offering to change their behavior without acknowledging the underlying attitudes that had created the problem in the first place. They wanted to modify their approach to managing my choices rather than questioning their right to manage them at all. "I appreciate the invitation," I told them as we stood in the foyer, "but I'm not ready for family dinners yet. I need more time to think about what kind of relationship I want with all of you." My father looked genuinely confused. "What kind of relationship? You're our daughter. We're your family. What's to think about?" The question revealed the depth of our disconnect. For him, family relationships were fixed, defined by biology and obligation rather than choice and compatibility. The idea that I might evaluate our relationship based on how it served my emotional well-being was foreign to his understanding of how families worked. "The kind of relationship where I'm treated as an adult capable of making my own decisions," I explained. "The kind where my choices are respected even when they don't align with your preferences. The kind where love isn't contingent on meeting your expectations." I could see them processing this information, trying to reconcile their traditional understanding of family dynamics with my explicit demands for autonomy and respect. It would take time for them to adjust, if they ever could. Some worldviews were too deeply ingrained to change quickly. Driving home that night, I reflected on the strange satisfaction of finally confronting the dynamics that had shaped my entire relationship with my family. The conversation hadn't resolved everything, but it had clarified the terms of any future relationship. I was no longer the daughter seeking their approval. I was an adult offering them the opportunity to know me on my terms. The next morning brought a handwritten letter from my father, delivered by courier to my office. His banker's precision extended to his penmanship, each word carefully formed in the blue ink he had used for important documents throughout my childhood. "Emma," it began, "last night's conversation has given me much to consider. I realize now that my approach to your career choices has been influenced more by my own fears than by careful evaluation of your actual prospects. I was wrong to dismiss your judgment, and I was wrong to express my concerns in such hurtful terms. You have accomplished something remarkable, and you did it despite my lack of faith, rather than because of my support. I hope someday you will give me the opportunity to prove that I can be the father you deserve, rather than the investment advisor you never asked for." The letter was signed simply, "Dad," without his usual formal signature. It was the closest thing to a genuine apology I had ever received from him, and it represented a level of self-reflection that gave me hope for our future relationship. But apologies, no matter how sincere, couldn't erase the year of silence or the decades of conditional support that had preceded it. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent behavior to rebuild. My family would have to demonstrate their newfound respect through actions rather than words, and that process would unfold on my timeline, not theirs. The worst investment was finally ready to set the terms for any future returns. Part 5. The Final Resolution. December 2020 arrived with an invitation that I had been expecting for weeks. Cream cardstock, elegant calligraphy, my mother's signature attention to detail evident in every carefully chosen word. "The Collins family cordially invites you to join us for Christmas Eve dinner. We understand if you're not ready, but the door is always open and you are deeply missed." I held the invitation in my hands, studying the familiar address where I had grown up, remembering Christmas mornings filled with excitement and family traditions that had once felt unbreakable. Exactly 1 year had passed since the dinner that changed everything. 1 year since my father had called me his worst investment and unknowingly launched the most transformative period of my life. The timing felt deliberate, though I wasn't sure whether my family understood the significance or if it was simply coincidence. Either way, the symbolism was perfect. A full circle, an opportunity to measure the distance I had traveled from that humiliated daughter to the woman I had become. My life had continued evolving in ways that still surprised me. The transition to Brenner Industries had been seamless, and my role as vice president of global operations had exceeded even Klaus's ambitious expectations. I was dividing my time between Austin, Munich, and London, overseeing supply chain integrations across 3 continents and building relationships with clients whose annual revenues exceeded the GDP of small countries. The financial reality of my stock options had settled into something resembling normalcy, though the numbers remained surreal. After taxes and diversification into more traditional investments, I controlled assets worth approximately $97 million. The money had purchased freedom rather than luxury, the freedom to choose projects based on interest rather than necessity, to travel without worrying about expense accounts, to make decisions based on personal values rather than financial constraints. More importantly, I had gained something that couldn't be quantified in stock options or salary negotiations: absolute confidence in my own judgment. The girl who had once sought family approval for every major decision had been replaced by a woman who trusted her own instincts and accepted responsibility for her own choices. The transformation was internal, but its effects rippled through every aspect of my life. David and I had moved in together the previous month, sharing a penthouse apartment in downtown Austin with views that stretched across the entire city. Our relationship had deepened into something that felt both passionate and sustainable, built on mutual admiration and shared ambitions rather than traditional expectations about gender roles or life timelines. He celebrated my successes without feeling threatened by them, and I supported his career without feeling diminished by his achievements. The contrast with my family's approach to relationships was stark. David had never suggested that I was too focused on work or that I should prioritize family obligations over professional opportunities. He understood that my career wasn't just a job, but an expression of my core identity, and he valued that dedication rather than trying to redirect it toward more conventional priorities. As Christmas approached, I found myself genuinely curious about how my family had processed the events of the past year. My grandmother had kept me updated on family news through brief phone calls, carefully avoiding taking sides while making it clear that she remained proud of my choices. According to her reports, my parents had undergone what sounded like genuine self-reflection, questioning assumptions about success and family dynamics that had never been challenged before. Jake had apparently enrolled in business school, inspired by what he had learned about entrepreneurship and strategic thinking through researching my company. Melissa had started a nonprofit focused on healthcare accessibility, channeling her medical expertise towards systemic change rather than individual patient care. Even my parents had made changes. My mother had returned to the art classes she had abandoned decades earlier, while my father had begun mentoring young professionals at a local nonprofit focused on financial literacy. The changes suggested growth and introspection, but I remained cautious about interpreting them too optimistically. People could modify their behavior without fundamentally altering their underlying attitudes, and I had learned to value consistency over good intentions. Time would reveal whether their evolution was genuine or simply strategic adaptation to changed circumstances. The decision about Christmas dinner required careful consideration. I wasn't avoiding my family out of anger anymore. That phase had passed months earlier. Instead, I was protecting something precious, the peace and clarity I had discovered in defining my own worth rather than seeking external validation. Any reunion would need to strengthen rather than undermine that foundation. After discussing the situation with David and seeking input from my grandmother, I decided to attend Christmas dinner with specific conditions. I would arrive after the meal had begun, stay for exactly 2 hours, and leave before the evening devolved into the kind of extended family bonding that had historically made me uncomfortable. I would participate as an adult visitor rather than a returning daughter, maintaining the boundaries that had become essential to my well-being. Christmas Eve was unseasonably warm for Austin, with temperatures in the 70s and clear skies that made the city feel more like California than Texas. I drove to my parents' house in my new Tesla, a small indulgence that reflected both my changed financial circumstances and my commitment to environmental sustainability. The familiar streets of Westlake Hills looked exactly as I remembered, unchanged by the dramatic transformation of my relationship with the family who lived there. I parked in the driveway behind Jake's truck and sat for a moment, collecting my thoughts and reinforcing my intentions for the evening. I wasn't returning as a prodigal daughter seeking reconciliation or approval. I was visiting as an autonomous adult, curious about my family's growth but not dependent on their acceptance or understanding. The front door opened before I had a chance to ring the bell. My mother appeared, wearing a red velvet dress and the kind of nervous smile that suggested she had been watching for my arrival. Her greeting was warm but careful, as if she were welcoming a distinguished guest rather than her own daughter. "Emma, you look absolutely radiant. That dress is gorgeous. Come in. Everyone's so excited to see you." The house smelled like pine needles and cinnamon, familiar scents that triggered a flood of childhood memories. The decorations were elaborate as always. Garland draped along the staircase, a 12-foot Christmas tree in the living room, and enough twinkling lights to power a small town. The overall effect was magical, though I noticed it with the detached appreciation of someone admiring a museum display rather than feeling the nostalgic warmth of returning home. The family was gathered in the dining room, and conversation paused when I entered. The silence wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt more like respectful acknowledgement than awkward uncertainty. Jake stood up immediately and crossed the room to hug me, his embrace genuine rather than obligatory. "Em, you look incredible. Success suits you." Melissa followed with a similar greeting, though hers carried an undertone of professional assessment. "You've definitely found your confidence. I can see it in how you carry yourself." My father remained seated at the head of the table, but his expression was different from what I remembered. The casual authority I had grown up with had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more tentative. When our eyes met, he nodded, respectfully rather than expecting me to come to him. "Emma, thank you for joining us. I know this might feel strange after everything that's happened." The acknowledgement surprised me. A year ago, he would have minimized the significance of our estrangement, or suggested that we simply move forward without dwelling on past difficulties. His willingness to name the awkwardness directly suggested a level of emotional awareness that I hadn't expected. I took the seat that had been left empty for me, the same chair I had occupied during that fateful Christmas dinner. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, though no one commented directly. The conversation resumed gradually, family members sharing updates about their lives and asking careful questions about my work and travels. The questions were different this time. Instead of polite skepticism about my career choices, they showed genuine curiosity about the technical challenges of global supply chain management and the cultural complexities of working with international clients. Jake asked intelligent questions about market expansion strategies, while Melissa wanted to understand how technology could be applied to healthcare logistics problems. My father's questions were the most revealing. He asked about risk management in emerging markets, competitive analysis methodologies, and the decision-making frameworks I used for major strategic initiatives. These were the kinds of questions he asked peers and clients, indicating that he was finally treating my professional expertise with the respect he had always reserved for other accomplished adults. "Your international expansion work sounds fascinating," he said during a lull in the conversation. "I've been reading about supply chain disruptions in the business journals, and it's clear that the solutions you've developed are genuinely innovative. I have to admit, I didn't understand the market opportunity when you first described it." The admission was significant, coming from a man who rarely acknowledged the limitations of his own knowledge. It suggested not just intellectual humility, but a willingness to reconsider fundamental assumptions about business and success. As dinner progressed, I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't expected. The conversation felt more like a gathering of adults sharing their respective expertise rather than a family meeting where some members were expected to defer to others. My opinions were solicited and respected, my experiences were valued, and my choices were discussed without implied criticism or unsolicited advice. The most profound moment came when my mother asked about my relationship with David. In the past, such questions had carried undertones about marriage timelines, family planning expectations, and social conventions. This time, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding what made our partnership work and how we balanced two demanding careers. "He sounds like a wonderful match for you," she said after I described our recent trip to Vienna for a medical conference where David had presented research while I attended strategic planning meetings for Brenner's European operations. "It must be nice to have someone who understands professional ambition." The comment revealed a level of insight that surprised me. My mother had always prioritized family relationships over career achievements, and her implicit criticism of my work focus had been a constant source of tension. Her recognition that professional partnership could be as important as romantic compatibility suggested genuine evolution in her thinking. As the evening wore on, I realized that my family had indeed changed, though perhaps not in the ways I had initially expected. They hadn't become different people, but they had developed greater self-awareness about their own limitations and assumptions. They had learned to recognize expertise they didn't possess and to value achievements they didn't fully understand. More importantly, they had begun to separate their love for me from their need to control or direct my choices. The subtle shift was evident in how they asked questions, offered support, and discussed my future plans. They were interested and engaged without being invasive or prescriptive. When it came time to leave, my father asked if he could speak with me privately. We stepped onto the back patio, where the outdoor heater created a warm circle of light against the December evening. For a moment, we stood silently looking out over the garden where I had played as a child, both of us processing the significance of the conversation we were about to have. "Emma," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding certainty, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that you were right about something fundamental that I completely missed." He paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that this moment would define our future relationship. "You weren't just building a career or pursuing financial success. You were becoming the person you were meant to be, and you did it despite my lack of support rather than because of my guidance." The words hit me with unexpected emotional force. This wasn't just an apology for harsh words spoken in frustration. It was recognition of my fundamental autonomy and competence as an adult. "I spent so many years thinking my job as your father was to protect you from making mistakes that I forgot my real job was to trust you to make good decisions. You didn't need my investment advice or career counseling. You needed my confidence in your judgment, and I failed to provide that when it mattered most." He looked directly at me, his expression carrying the weight of genuine regret. "When I called you my worst investment, I wasn't just being cruel. I was revealing something ugly about how I had been thinking about our relationship. You were never my investment, Emma. You were my daughter, and the return I should have been seeking was your happiness and fulfillment, not your conformity to my expectations." The distinction was profound, and hearing him articulate it clearly meant more to me than any financial success or professional recognition I had achieved. This was the validation I had been seeking my entire life. Acknowledgement that my worth wasn't contingent on meeting someone else's definition of success. "Thank you, Dad," I said quietly. "That means everything to me." We hugged then, not with the obligatory embrace of family duty, but with the genuine affection of two adults who had found their way back to mutual respect. The gesture felt like closure on the painful chapter that had begun with last year's Christmas dinner and transformation into something healthier and more sustainable. Driving home that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. The girl who had been called the worst investment had become a woman whose professional expertise was valued globally and whose personal judgment was finally respected by the people who mattered most to her. The path had been painful at times, but it had led to something I hadn't even known I was seeking: the freedom to be myself without apology or explanation. My phone buzzed with a text from David asking how the evening had gone. "Better than expected," I replied. "Much better." Another message came from my grandmother. "Proud of you for giving them another chance. Even prouder that you did it on your own terms." The next morning brought a final surprise: a handwritten note from my father, delivered with a small wrapped gift. The note was brief: "For the daughter who taught me that the best investments are the ones you make without expecting anything in return." Inside the box was a vintage fountain pen, the kind he had always used for signing important documents, along with an engraved nameplate that read, "Emma Collins, VP Global Operations, Brenner Industries." The gesture was perfect in its simplicity. He had finally learned to celebrate my achievements without trying to claim credit for them or redirect them toward different goals. The pen was both an acknowledgement of my professional success and a symbol of his confidence in whatever I might accomplish next. As I sat in my downtown apartment, watching the sunrise paint Austin's skyline in shades of gold and pink, I realized that the worst investment my father had ever made had finally paid the dividends that mattered most. Not financial returns, but understanding. Not conformity to his expectations, but respect for my own choices. Not validation of his judgment, but confidence in mine. The Christmas dinner that had broken something between us had ultimately created space for something better to grow. Sometimes the most devastating moments become the foundation for the most meaningful transformations. Sometimes being called the worst investment is exactly the catalyst you need to become your own best return. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.